Right now, I'd like to introduce our special guest. He's senior counsel, or he was senior counsel and special advisor with the CFPB. And while he was there, he led the initiative resulting in TRID and the design of the disclosures. He has also served as a senior attorney in the FDIC, and he's currently the managing member of Garris Horn. He's coming to us today from sunny Tucson, Arizona. Welcome, Rich Horn.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. This is a pleasure to be here.
Well, we love having you here, Richard. We appreciate you making some time for us. Let's jump right into the good stuff here. And I'll start with a question on coronavirus, because what else will we talk about, right?
Yeah.
So, Richard, what impact has the coronavirus and the subsequent economic freeze or dive had on the regulatory or legislative side of the mortgage industry, or what effect will it have as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. One I've been getting actually quite a bit from my clients, having dealt a lot with the TRID rule and other mortgage origination rules. You might be thinking, well, this is really impacting servicing because of the forbearance relief under the CARES Act and foreclosure moratoriums. But there are impacts on origination rules as well. And having led TRID, that's a rule that's near and dear to my heart. So I'll just mention one of those impacts, and that is that the CFPB issued an interpretive rule that gave guidance on when lenders can use coronavirus as a bona fide personal financial emergency to waive the 3 business day waiting period to close after receipt of a CD, as well as the 3 business day waiting period for rescission and the 7 business day waiting period for the LE. And so the CFPB's goal with that was to allow consumers to close sooner if they need to because of coronavirus. Lenders are trying to figure out how and where to work this into their origination process. There's also a lot of technical questions about whether the CFPB really intended lenders to just say, hey, because of Corona, now we can close all our transactions without waiting these 3 days. And so, hooray for consumers, hooray for us. And lenders can not have to worry about the traditional method of supporting a bona fide personal financial emergency, which is with a consumer written statement and documenting the emergency to waive the 3 and 7 day periods. But that's not what the CFPB was saying. I think there was some, kind of gleeful, wishful thinking from the press release. And so what the CFPB actually said in the interpretive rules, hey, you still got to do your homework. You got to support that there is an emergency, that they need to close, in advance of the 3 day waiting period. And the consumer still has to submit that written statement. And so a lot of lenders might be using this regulatory relief without actually doing the proper homework. So that's something I've been talking to my clients about. And then, just generally what the impact is, and I think we've talked about this offline, there's just so much change now with regulatory relief under the CARES Act. CFPB is putting out FAQs that are even less formal than an interpretive rule that say, hey, we're not going to examine for this, or we are going to examine for this, but not this. And so there's so much as a compliance professional to keep track of, both on the servicing and origination side, that even from state regulators as well, and state legislatures saying, hey, we're going to pass this law to allow for remote online notarization, and we're gonna relax the licensing rules for branch offices because so many people are working from home now. There's so much change that as a compliance professional, it's just hard to keep on top of it all. And then, in the example that I mentioned, it's easy to trip up when you can't really dive into all the details as well as you might like. And so hopefully regulators recognize that this is just a ton of change all at once. And, even if they aren't saying explicitly that they're going to take good faith efforts to come into compliance with all of this at this time, that they do that in practice, because it just is really difficult. Like, I know a lot of clients are asking for us to do state reviews of all of the changes, in this region or that region or all 50 states. And so I know this is something that a lot of lenders are trying to keep on top of, but they need help.
Well, you make a great point there, Richard. And of course, while TRID is a federal rule, we've also got change at 50 state level, right? And we
Yeah.
still have on a lot of, you mentioned payroll protection, we're still getting new guidelines every day, and they're changing
That's
over
right.
and over. So it's kind of a moving target for you. How are you guys at your firm kind of keeping up with all those changes, and what are you kind of advising? Not to ask for free legal advice here, but certainly what kind of general advice are you giving clients in dealing with this ever-changing environment?
If clients ask us to do a review of a certain state's changes, both at the legislative and state regulator levels, we do that. And so some of it is client driven. What clients ask for, we'll do. But we do this work for clients and also interpret it for them as well.
Sure. And I'll ask one final question here and then we'll move on, Richard. Again, with all of this change, at some point, the enforcement agencies will be looking back on this. Do you think there'll be some level of forgiveness for good faith efforts? Do you think there'll be some leniency, or, well, and of course, no one knows for sure, but what are you guys foreseeing there?
So the wrinkle with that's a great question, and the wrinkle with that is the regulators could say, yeah, we're going to examine for this or not for this, and don't worry about if you meet this time frame for sending out this required notice, because we're not going to really look too closely at it. But really, what I would be worried about as a lender or a servicer right now is which provisions have borrower potential for borrower lawsuits, civil liability, because the CFPB could say, or other regulators could say, we're not going to examine for this, but that doesn't affect what liability you have under the law if you get sued by a borrower, and God forbid, in a class action. So there is still risk there, even if the bureau says that they're not going to examine something. I hope that they take a general good faith approach in examinations, like I said at the beginning, because there just is so much change.
Yeah.
But that doesn't affect private liability from borrower lawsuits, and so you still have to keep on top of what are your legal obligations. That's something that comes into play a lot with TRID. So bringing it back to my original example, to your first question, with this interpretive rule, the bureau might say, yeah, and they might make it sound in the press release, we really want you to use this new regulatory relief to be able to use coronavirus as a bona fide personal financial emergency. And they actually even have in the interpretive rule a sentence that says, we encourage lenders to tell borrowers about this, right? Well, that doesn't affect whether there is civil liability for that provision, the timing provisions for the CD, whether the CD was received on time, or other issues with the TRID disclosures. And so there is a potential a court could find that there wasn't a bona fide personal financial emergency, and so you didn't meet the timing requirements, and there's some kind of damages that the lender is responsible for in a borrower lawsuit. And God forbid a lender takes this more lenient approach with coronavirus bona fide personal financial emergencies, and uses them across the board. You could find yourself facing a potentially costly class action lawsuit, both to defend and also potential damages. So
Sure.
I can't say for sure on this call, because I haven't looked it up, whether you'd be facing what kind of damages you'd be facing, but that's something I'd be worried about. So no matter what the CFPB says, what they're going to examine for, it's there's still a chance that you could trip up on all of this stuff, and even with an interpretive rule where they're giving you guidance, like formal guidance under the rule, that there's still an opportunity to trip up and face some liability. So it's just kind of living through the changes of coronavirus makes it harder to find out where those landmines are.
Sure. Uncertain across the board, and that keeps your life interesting, at least, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'll get questions from clients. Hey, what do I do with this situation? And you got to answer answer them to point out the risk to your clients, but
Right.
with also clients who are with the bank's customers who are facing real life difficult situations because of coronavirus, then you're asking this really factual questions. Well, does this amount to an emergency, right? What is an emergency? Is it a convenience? Like I got to drive further, or my seller wants to sell so they can move to Kiribati or something. Like I
Right.
don't
Well,
know
no, exactly.
what's an emergency, right?
Exactly. And yeah, you're right. You've got to collect all the facts before you jump in there. So,
Yeah, yeah,
well, Richard, I'm going to pull back to an even bigger view here. And I've heard over the last year or so, I've heard from several, I'll add on the business side, not from any attorneys that I know, but from the business side, there's some suggesting that maybe the aggressive enforcement trend of the past few years is starting to go back a little bit towards, I don't want to say leniency, but it's starting to abate. Would you agree with that? And really kind of what are the trends you're seeing in terms of enforcement in the mortgage industry today? Coronavirus notwithstanding, what kind of enforcement trends are we looking at over the last year and the next year and so forth?
yeah. That's a great question too, and one I get from clients also. So it's something that is a top of mind for people, even in this time of coronavirus. How has enforcement changed during this coronavirus pandemic? Can we expect the CFPB to be a little slower in enforcement? And I think that's you know unfortunately not the case. I think with the change in leadership to former acting director Mulvaney and current director Kraninger, that people thought, well, now we have a Republican leadership of the agency, so enforcement will really be non-existent. Um, you know, that's not what we've seen. We've seen a lot of CIDs. We've seen a lot of, I think, most petitions to set aside CIDs that were at least submitted under Director Kraninger's leadership be rejected by Director Kraninger. So that's kind of a sign that she supports the enforcement staff, I think. And then we've seen maybe not as many enforcement actions as under former Director Cordray, but we've still seen them come out at a good clip. And actually against some larger institutions, including Citizens Bank and Fifth Third Bank. So it's not, I think it's an inaccurate view that the CFPB is not enforcing anymore. And I think you still need to be on your toes. What we've seen at our firm, because we do some of this enforcement work as well, as CIDs go out to clients of all sizes, and CFPB being not I wouldn't say overly aggressive, but still as aggressive as they had been in their enforcement of the law. So that's something that I think that the industry needs to basically keep in mind, that they are still under Director Kraninger, a cop on the beat that wants to enforce the law, and so it's not. You can't treat it like the Wild Wild West now, where no one's going to be looking over your shoulder. Yeah.
Sure. And of course, as if we haven't had enough in 2020 between the COVID virus and, of course, now we have civil unrest on the date that we're recording this podcast, and we even have a few murder hornets flying around. What else, And
Yes.
on top of that, we've got a general presidential election coming in November, which, not to make it a political conversation, doesn't matter who you like, but that's always a big deal in our industry as well. Talk a little bit about, and of course, the election itself doesn't affect regulation and enforcement directly, immediately, but it still has, in the long run, a big impact on what you're going to be advising clients down the road, right?
Yeah. So let's say that there's a change in leadership, at the CFPB because the presidential election. That could be a huge change for the industry. So, President Biden doesn't like Director Kraninger's record, and either with or without cause, depending on the seal of law case turns out, could remove Director Kraninger and put in place his own director of the Bureau. And that would really change how the Bureau approaches a lot of the pending rules, if they haven't come out yet. For example, ATR-QM, if that's not finalized, hopefully they finalize something, because we don't want the patch under the ATR GSC patch under the ATR-QM rule to just go away without something in place or an extension or something like that. But let's say that rule in substance is still pending. Well, then the new director would be the one who would be finalizing that rule. For example, enforcement could change. One thing that Director Kreninger has been criticized by Democrats over has been in the level of enforcement. Like I said, I think the enforcement is still happening at a decent clip. Maybe not as much as under former Director Cordray, but she's still taking heat from Democrats. So I could see a new. Actually, I should mention one area where she's taken a lot of heat on is fair lending, and that's something at our firm we have seen CFPB investigate and enforce is fair lending. We had a couple of fair lending investigations that we actually have a couple of fair lending investigations that are pending right now. So we know that they're looking at fair lending, but she still has been taking heat from the Democrats on the Hill for that. So I could see fair lending enforcement really step up. I think there's a view from Republicans on the Hill and Republican leadership right now at the CFPB that disparate impact isn't an allowable theory under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which is the CFPB's fair lending law that they enforce. And so CFPB hasn't been using that, but if there's a new democratically appointed director of the agency, they could turn more towards those disparate impact cases that they had used in the past, like against the indirect auto lenders. So we could see that change. Right now, they're focused a lot, and they actually say this in their fair lending publications, including the last fair lending report and prior reports to Congress. They say that they're really interested right now. Their primary focus in fair lending is in mortgage origination on redlining and marketing discrimination. That's something that we've seen at our firm. That's the topic of the investigations we've seen is, and that's essentially where a lender doesn't market enough to certain minority areas in their MSAs, doesn't get enough applications from minorities in their MSAs, and putting that together, the CFPB says that there is an intent to discriminate using the disparate treatment theory, not disparate impact. And whether that's even allowable under ECOA, there's a lot of legal questions about that, but that's something the CFPB has actually been trying to enforce, and actually trying to enforce that against non-banks. So that's something that I think non-banks need to keep in mind right now in terms of enforcement. But if there is a change in administration and leadership at the CFPB, I think that'll become much more front and center. I think the CFPB will probably try and test some disparate treatment marketing discrimination cases against non-bank mortgage lenders. I foresee that.
Well, so as a compliance attorney, of course, you're going to be on, not that you're ever not on your toes. It's a challenging line of work to begin with, but sounds like 2020 is going to be an extra volatile year for you guys out there.
Yeah, even if Director Kreninger, stays in leadership, I think with all the regulatory change, I mean, there's some major rules. Like I mentioned, ATR-QM is out there. There's a TRID look back that's supposed to be published this fall, which could lead to even some more TRID changes. And like I said before, even under Director Kreninger, they're looking at these fair lending issues as well. So I think, even if there isn't a change in administration, we'll still be busy with all of the rules and enforcement that they're doing. Yeah.
I can imagine. And you mentioned a few trends to look for in the coming year, Richard. What else, if anything, should lenders or even service providers and vendors, what should they be focusing on right now in terms of whether it be regulatory, legislative, or enforcement?
I think the major rules to look out for from CFPB, the ATR-QM changes that I mentioned, that really just will change the marketplace. It just will. And so what the CFPB does with that is something to stay on top of. They're not even at the proposed rule stage yet. They haven't issued that. But that, based on previous statements, we that should be forthcoming. We should see it soon. Also, just because of the GSC patch, expiring next year, they need to get get a move on that rule. So
Yeah.
I think we'll see that soon, or something having to do with that rule soon. And then the trade look back, I think, will be really instructive. Some trade groups are putting out comment letters to other CFPB requests for information about trade problems, and I'm sure the trade look back will address some of those problems that have been cited by the industry, and that could very well lead to some changes to the trade rule. I wouldn't be surprised if they have some kind of proposed rule or ANPR or something that comes out soon after that, saying, "Hey, we're thinking about doing X, Y, and Z." Other changes, obviously, there's been a slew of servicing issues come up because of the coronavirus pandemic. And the CFPB also being interested in fair lending could start doing investigations, and other regulators too could start doing investigations on whether the implementation of these regulatory relief programs under the CARES Act and other private programs or state programs, whether they were administered in some kind of discriminatory way. Again, that probably would be for the CFPB a disparate treatment claim. But that's something that I would, if you're administering those types of programs, just keep on track of, because with so much heat on the CFPB now for fair lending, and probably some easy targets in that respect, with these really quickly rolled out programs with, basically servicers having to slap this stuff together on the fly. Yeah. And lenders too, how are they taking into account in, their originations and, in refinancing borrowers? How are they taking into account whether borrowers had some form of regulatory relief? That could lead to some fair lending issues as well. Sure. And so, all of these new issues with the CFPB's focus on fair lending could lead to problems. So I think lenders could keep an eye on that. But just in general, like we talked about at the beginning, the amount of regulatory change is just so much to keep on track of. I think I would just try and step back, take a bird's eye view of everything that's changed, when things are expected to, moratoriums are expected to expire, and what changes we can expect in the future. I mean, just even keeping on track of how to do e-closings in all these states is hard, because which states now have remote online notary laws, and what do they say, and what are the details, right. And who needs to be where to do it, and stuff like that. So
that's its own show. We are going to be talking about Ron, of course, the remote online notarization at some point soon. Maybe we'll have you. Hopefully, you'll come back and join us for that one as well. And of course, you mentioned on the fly, one of the mortal enemies of process making or rule making, and seems like a lot of it's been on the fly the last few months. It's been an odd year. So I want to take sort of a hard left turn on that one, Richard. Recently, we had some mutual friends on the show, Charles Kane and Mark Sturbko and Trip Riley, and I asked them this question as well. So I want to ask you too. In theory, we've got fall conference season coming around for the mortgage industry, and I know you're a regular on the circuit, both as a speaker and as an attendee, and it's a good chance for the industry to kind of catch up, see folks they haven't seen in person for a long time. But, we still have the coronavirus, even though, we haven't done away with it by fiat or regulation just yet. That virus is out there. And the question becomes, even as the country, so to speak, opens up again, what kind of impact will that virus have when we get to September, October, November? Will those conferences, do you think, and not so much will they, but should they go on as normal? Should they be virtual? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about that right now, because I have a 3-year-old and a 2-month-old. So
congratulations.
An infant, whether I travel to certain conferences is a conversation we're having right now in our house. And, even if fall conference season is on, am I going to take that risk to travel to them, go through the airports, and, the airlines say, the plane air is as clean as office air, or what have you. I read a little about this, and but that still get afraid of just walking through the airports. Some airports are cleaner than others, as you probably know. You travel.
I live in Cleveland. We could just end on that right there. So, but not the best of airports. All
Yeah,
free.
I know if you've walked through LaGuardia recently, you can see. Yeah, not so nice. It's a former New Yorker. I can ding them on that. But
oh yeah,
the virtual conference thing is great. It's a great option to have. It is not, unfortunately, something that should replace like in-person conferences long term. Just because you lose that face-to-face personal contact, that's after the session. So as you know, when I do a session and I speak at a conference, I usually have a line of 100 people waiting to talk to me after. So
yeah, I don't have that problem, and I don't think I speak quite as frequently. But yeah, that's a great point. It's not easy to do on a Zoom call or something like that.
Yeah, especially when I was at the bureau writing TRID, right? When it was proposed, I'd go out and speak as a bureau employee about the TRID rule, and I saw my goal for that is to get as much information from the public as possible. And industry folks had just so much great information, both on how the rule would be implemented on a industry-wide basis, how all the different parties have to play together, and also just on a day-to-day basis, how is the interaction with the consumer going to be, and then going to different parts of the country. Different parts of the country have different situations come up and different ways of closing real estate transactions. And so, as a bureau employee, going to different parts of the country to get that information from the public was so vital to the success of the rule. And I think just that at least the industry people that I met face to face really seemed to get a lot out of it, also because I could explain a lot of the purposes and intents of the rule, and what we were thinking, and this provision and that provision. And now with a lot of regulatory change going on, you don't have that access to the regulators anymore with these virtual things. I don't see a lot of. I hadn't seen a lot of bureau employees speaking at a lot of conferences in the past few years, I guess because of budgets. I guess I should say traveling to conferences. They would show up at the DC conferences, but especially with these virtual conferences now and the issues with travel, I could see that just being even harder to get that kind of one-on-one contact between the regulator and folks in the public, and that's unfortunate, because there is, like I said, there's the benefit to the agency to get a lot of feedback from people, just even an informal feedback after a session talking about the rule. And oftentimes when you do that, there'd be like 10 people standing around you listening to what you're saying and chiming in as well. Yep. So it ends up being like really, a nice conversation. And then, for the public, not getting the access to the regulators to meet them, to talk to them about what was the intent of this part of the rule or that part of the rule. I think that those face-to-face conversations are valuable for both sides of the equation. And so that's one unfortunate impact of this. But, from an industry point of view, I'm just glad that folks like you guys are putting out great content virtually. And, Mortgage Bankers Association just did their legal issues conference virtually as well. They call it MBA Live, and it was great. Right. A lot of great content there as well. So there's some good alternatives for the time being. Hopefully all this ends at some point and we can go back to having those more face-to-face, easier contacts than having to log on, make sure you have the most updated software, and as my internet speed up to speed.
Well, I will give an aside here if you don't mind. We originally had, for our viewers, we had Richard on once before, but you didn't see him for just that reason. We had technical difficulties, and unfortunately he had to drop off, and he was gracious enough to come back and record with us again. So if anyone knows about that search, I've had the same issues myself. I'm the Bermuda Triangle of technology. Things just go haywire when I'm near them. One
Yeah.
last thing I will mention. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Richard. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, I mean, just even with everybody, I hear this from all my clients too. Everyone's working from home, just so everybody in your neighborhood working from home, everyone's internet slowed down, and
Yeah.
just trying to use technology. Sometimes, technology is great, but it is there. It's fallible. It can
Yeah.
break
No
stuff.
substitute for human contact, that's for sure. And that's I guess, the hell of this virus. I will give you a little piece of advice, one dad to another, and congratulations on your newest, by the way.
Thank you.
They're young children. Mine are a little bit older. I've got a 7 and a 14-year-old, and trust me, after a while, what you'll hear from them is, Dad, you should travel as often as possible. Why don't you go out? So enjoy these years. So, uh,
That's great advice. Yeah.
so on that note, I've just got one final question for you, Richard. We're going to do a lightning round as we did with some of our friends in the past. And I think I know what you're going to say, but we're going to let you say it anyways. And our lightning round topic today, the virtual happy hour. I'm game or really lame?
So I have to say I'm game because my partner Troy does virtual happy hours. So he usually sends out invites. I don't know if it's every week or every other week or something to a bunch of people, and he says that they turn out to be really great conversations about this or that. I haven't had the opportunity to log in, so I can't say personally, but the feedback has been positive. Again, I think that you do kind of lose that face-to-face interaction, like I was talking about before. But you got to do what you got to do, and I think that's a great alternative. So,
well, there's one other problem too, there, Richard. No drink specials, never.
That's right.
I've never found one yet, but I'm with you. Sometimes it's better than nothing, and it does bring you in touch with people maybe you haven't seen in a while. So you're going to go with game. I'm going to go with lame, but I'll accept that they have. Sometimes that's all we can do.
Right.
Richard, we really appreciate you joining us today. If one of the viewers wants to reach you, and we will post this in the show notes as well on our website and on the YouTube channel, but how can folks reach you if they want to get to you?
Yeah, our website is www.garrishorn.com, GARRISHORN.com. And you can find my contact information there, and Troy's information, and Roger and Ray as well, who I'm sure you know, Brian. So we're all up there. And in the near future, we should have some announcements, hopefully, of potentially future personnel joining us. So
Outstanding. And hopefully you'll be able to join us again here. Hopefully we haven't destroyed your reputation or
no, not at all.
So hopefully we'll have you back again. We'd love to have you, sir. And speaking of technology, you don't know this, but I record with a Generation 2 iPad, and it's down to 1%. So, Richard, thanks again, and Mr. Grant, take us home.